Black single father helps homeless teen with one-night stay, returns to work to find her running the company. Welcome to Elevate Stories. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with unexpected choices and second chances, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now sit back, relax, and let's begin. Some people are always trying to play savior. The comment wasn't meant to be loud, but it didn't need to be. George Benson heard it anyway. He stood behind the front desk of the boutique corporate hotel in downtown Chicago, shoulders squared despite the exhaustion pulling at them, eyes fixed on the young woman across the counter. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her hair hung in a loose ponytail that had given up hours ago, her jacket thin enough to show she'd underestimated the November cold pressing against the glass doors. A single duffel bag rested at her feet like it held everything that mattered, because it probably did. "I'm sorry," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I only need one night." Her fingers trembled as she counted wrinkled bills onto the marble counter. George didn't need to count them himself. He could see from here it wasn't enough. Not even close. He'd seen this look before. The careful composure people wore when they were one no away from shattering. Behind him, someone shifted. A throat cleared with pointed impatience. "George, we can't keep bending the rules. This isn't a shelter." The voice belonged to Marcus. Sharp, with the particular authority of someone who'd never had to beg for shelter himself. Another voice chimed in, smooth and cold as polished stone. "Exactly. Company policy exists for a reason. We have standards to maintain." That was Diane. Always Diane. George didn't turn around. He kept his attention on the girl instead, softening his voice like they were the only two people in the lobby. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, eyes darting briefly toward the judgment pooling behind him. "Andrea." No last name. She didn't trust him with it yet. "Okay, Andrea," George said, typing into the system with deliberate calm. "Let me see what we have available." There were rooms. There always were. The hotel was half empty on Tuesday nights, but policy was a different beast entirely. Full deposit. No exceptions. No flexibility for circumstances. The rule book had never cared about desperation. "How much are you short?" he asked quietly. Andrea swallowed, gave him the number. It was small enough to hurt. Small enough that it shouldn't have mattered to a corporation pulling in 6 figures a night. But rules were rules, apparently. George exhaled slowly through his nose. He thought of Malik, asleep right now in their cramped apartment across town. Thought of the nights he'd stood in lobbies just like this one with a child clinging to his leg, praying someone would look past the paperwork and see a human being instead. He reached into his pocket. "George," Marcus started, warning clear in his tone. George placed his own cash on the counter between Andrea's bills and the computer screen. "I'll cover the rest," he said calmly. As if he did this every night. "Just for tonight." Andrea's eyes went wide. I can pay you back tomorrow. I swear I can." He smiled, small and tired. "You don't owe me anything tonight. Just get some rest." For a heartbeat, she looked like she might cry. Instead, she nodded once, clutching the room key like it was made of glass. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," George said. "That's exactly why I did." Behind him, Diane's voice dropped into a mocking drawl. "Of course. Always the hero." George felt his jaw tighten, but he didn't respond. He watched Andrea walk toward the elevator, her posture a little straighter now, the duffel bag a little less heavy. Just before the doors closed, she turned back. Her eyes met his, sharp, clear, no longer clouded with fear. Like she was memorizing his face for something. like she was taking a photograph in her mind and filing it somewhere important. Then the elevator doors slid shut. The lobby fell silent. Marcus stepped closer, voice low and satisfied. "You know this could cost you your job, right? When management sees that receipt, you're done." Diane added, perfectly composed, "Policy violations don't get warnings anymore, George. Hope she was worth it." George straightened his name badge and went back to his screen. He knew he'd broken the rules. He'd made peace with that the moment he reached for his wallet. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that in less than 12 hours the girl in the thin jacket would be sitting at the head of a conference table, holding the rulebook that was supposed to destroy him, and rewriting his entire life. George barely slept that night. The next morning, he packed Malik's lunch with hands that moved on autopilot, kissed his forehead while he was still half asleep, and walked into the November cold with the steady resolve of a man bracing for impact. By the time he reached the hotel at 8:47 a.m., his supervisor was already waiting. "Conference room," the voice said, clipped and final. "Now." George carried the weight of that single night with him as he walked down the carpeted hallway. He'd rehearsed what he would say. He'd already accepted what would happen next. Then he opened the door, and Andrea was sitting at the head of the table. The rest of George's shift moved like cold honey, slow, heavy, impossible to shake off. Andrea disappeared into the elevator at 9:47 p.m. By 9:52, the whispers had already started. George could feel them more than hear them. The way Marcus leaned into Diane's space near the back office, the way their eyes flicked toward him and then away, too quickly to be innocent. The way the night manager, Carol, appeared from nowhere with her tablet clutched against her chest, lips pressed into a thin line that might have been concern or might have been judgment. He kept working, checked in a businessman with a rolling suitcase and a Bluetooth earpiece who didn't make eye contact, processed a late checkout, restocked the brochure rack even though it didn't need it. At 11:15, Marcus walked past the desk with his coat already on. "Night, George," he said, voice dripping with something that wasn't quite sympathy. "Hope tomorrow goes better for you." George didn't respond. Diane left 10 minutes later. She paused at the edge of the lobby, turned back like she'd forgotten something, then looked directly at him. "You know they track everything, right?" she said. "Every override, every discount, every personal transaction." She adjusted the strap of her purse. "Just thought you should know." The glass doors swung shut behind her. George stood alone at the desk, the lobby vast and echoing around him. The city lights beyond the windows blurred into streaks of gold and red. He thought about the $40 he'd placed on the counter, thought about the envelope of bills waiting on his kitchen table, electric, internet, Malik's after-school program, thought about whether doing the right thing was supposed to feel this much like falling. By the time George unlocked the door to his apartment, the sky had started to lighten into that bruised pre-dawn grey. The lock stuck, same as always. He shouldered it open, wincing at the familiar creak. "Daddy?" The small voice floated from the corner of the living room, soft and sleepy. George's chest loosened, just a little, just enough to breathe. "Hey, baby girl," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "What are you doing up?" Malik sat cross-legged on the couch in his two big pajamas, a blanket pulled around his waist. A sketch pad rested in his lap, coloured pencils scattered across the cushions like confetti. "I couldn't sleep," Malik said, rubbing his eyes, "so I was drawing." George dropped his keys onto the side table and crossed the room, sinking onto the couch beside his son. Every muscle in his body ached. He was 43 and felt 60. "Let me see," he murmured. Malik held up the drawing proudly. It was a building, tall, detailed, windows glowing warm yellow against a dark background. Two figures stood in front of it, holding hands, one tall, one small. "That's the hotel," Malik explained, tapping the paper. The one where you work, and that's us. George studied the picture. The care Malik had taken with each window, the way he'd drawn their hands connected, unbreakable. "It's beautiful," George said. Malik leaned against his side, warm and solid. "One day we'll live somewhere like that, right? With big windows and lights that stay on all the time." George's throat tightened. He thought of the $40, thought of the electric bill, thought of how easily promises could shatter when the world didn't care about your good intentions. "Yeah," he said softly. "One day." Malik yawned, satisfied with the answer. George carried him to bed, tucked the blanket around his shoulders, and watched him drift back to sleep within seconds. In the kitchen, George made instant coffee he didn't want and stared at the pile of envelopes on the table. He did the math in his head, shifted numbers around like puzzle pieces that wouldn't fit. $40 wasn't the world, but it also wasn't nothing. He thought about Andrea's face when she'd realized what he was doing, the disbelief, the gratitude. He thought about Diane's parting words. "They track everything." George pressed his palms against his eyes and exhaled slowly. Maybe he'd been reckless. Maybe he'd just signed his own termination notice. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Malik's drawing, two figures holding hands in front of a building full of light. He'd made his choice. Now he'd have to live with it. Morning came too fast. George packed Malik's lunch on autopilot. Sandwich, apple slices, juice box. Kissed his forehead while he was still half asleep and mumbled something about breakfast. Left the apartment while the hallway still smelled like someone else's coffee. The train ride downtown felt longer than usual, colder. He watched his reflection in the dark window and wondered if this was what condemned men felt like on their way to sentencing. When George walked through the hotel's employee entrance at 8:34 a.m., the atmosphere had changed. People moved differently. Voices dropped when he passed. Carol stood near the break room with her arms crossed, talking in low tones with someone from HR. She saw him, didn't smile. Marcus was already at the desk, typing with aggressive focus. He glanced up when George approached. "Morning," George said. Marcus nodded once. Didn't say it back. Diane arrived at 8:47, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. She set her purse down, logged into her terminal, and worked in silence. No small talk, no weather observations, nothing. At 9:12, George's phone buzzed. A text from Carol. "Conference room. Now." 2 words. No explanation. George's pulse kicked up. He glanced toward the back offices. Carol stood in the doorway, waiting. Her expression was unreadable. Professional detachment trained into a mask. "George?" she said, voice neutral. "They're ready for you." He nodded, straightened his name badge. Every instinct told him to run, but his feet carried him forward anyway. The hallway to the conference room stretched longer than it should have. Each step felt weighted, significant. George passed framed photos of the hotel's grand opening, awards for hospitality excellence, smiling corporate headshots of executives he'd never met. He stopped in front of the heavy wooden door, took a breath, prepared himself for the words he knew were coming. "We appreciate your service, but—" He turned the handle and stepped inside. And the world tilted sideways, because Andrea was sitting at the head of the conference table. But she wasn't the girl from last night. Her hair was styled, sleek, and professional. Her posture was composed, controlled. The thin jacket was gone, replaced by a tailored blazer that looked like it cost more than George's monthly rent. A laptop sat open in front of her, flanked by manila folders and documents George recognized. Financial reports, operational summaries, the kind of paperwork front desk supervisors never saw. She looked up, met his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Benson," she said evenly. The room swam. George's brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Around the table sat executives, managers, faces he vaguely recognized from corporate emails. All of them looked uncomfortable. Some wouldn't meet his gaze. "Please," Andrea continued, gesturing to an empty chair. "Sit down." George's legs moved on their own. He sat. Andrea folded her hands on the table, her expression calm and unreadable. "My name is Andrea Winifred," she said. "And as of Monday, I am the acting CEO of Winifred Hospitality Group." The air left George's lungs in a single rush. "Last night," Andrea continued, "I checked into this hotel without identification, without credentials, without any of the usual markers of status or authority. I wanted to see what it felt like to be invisible." Her gaze swept across the room. Several people shifted in their seats. "I saw exactly what I expected to see," she said quietly. "And one thing I didn't." She turned back to George. "Tell me, Mr. Benson, why did you help me?" George's mouth had gone dry. He stared at Andrea Winifred, and tried to reconcile the girl with trembling hands from last night with the woman sitting before him now. They were the same person. But they weren't. George started, then stopped. His voice sounded strange in the sudden quiet of the conference room. Andrea waited, patient, unreadable. George cleared his throat. "I helped you because I've been there," he said finally. "Because I know what it's like to need one safe night and not have it. And because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because sometimes the rules aren't written for people like us." Silence settled over the room like snow. To George's left, Marcus had gone pale. Diane sat frozen 2 seats down, her usual composure cracked at the edges. Carol, the night manager, stared at her folded hands like they held answers she desperately needed. Andrea nodded slowly, something flickering in her expression that might have been approval, or sadness, or both. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Benson," she said. Then she opened the manila folder in front of her. George caught a glimpse of printed screenshots, security camera stills, timestamps in the corner, 9:43 p.m., 9:51 p.m., 10:02 p.m. His stomach dropped. "For those who don't know," Andrea continued, her voice calm but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut, "my grandfather built this company 43 years ago on a very simple principle. Hospitality means seeing people as human beings first, guests second, and transactions never." She pulled out the first image. Even from where George sat, he could see it clearly. The lobby desk, Andrea standing at the counter, Marcus visible in the background. "Over the past 18 months, I've noticed a pattern in our customer satisfaction scores. Complaints about staff dismissiveness, reports of discriminatory treatment, guests who felt judged before they even reached their rooms." Andrea's gaze swept the table. "So, I decided to see it for myself." She laid out another image. This one showed Diane leaning close to Marcus. Their expressions caught mid-conversation. The timestamp read 9:48 p.m. "We have audio too," Andrea said quietly. "The lobby microphones are quite sophisticated." Marcus shifted in his seat. Sweat had started to bead at his hairline. Andrea didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Would you like me to play it, Mr. Holloway? Or would you prefer to tell everyone yourself what you said about our guest?" Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. His face had gone from pale to grey. "That's what I thought." Andrea moved to the next document, a transcript, words printed in neat black columns. She didn't read from it. She quoted from memory. "This isn't a shelter. We have standards. If she can't afford the deposit, there are other options." Each phrase landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. "Ms. Chen," Andrea said, turning to Diane, "you told Mr. Benson that helping a guest in need would cost him his job. You also made a comment about him always playing the hero. Would you like to explain what you meant by that?" Diane's composure finally shattered. That's not... I was just trying to protect company policy." "Policy," Andrea interrupted softly, "is not the same as principles, and mockery is never professional, regardless of the circumstance." She pulled out another document. More screenshots, more timestamps. George recognized the moment Andrea had walked toward the elevator, the way she'd turned back to look at him before the doors closed. "Here's what else I saw last night," Andrea continued. "I saw a young woman in genuine need. I saw staff members who chose judgment over compassion. And I saw one employee who chose differently." Her eyes found George's across the table. "Mr. Benson violated company policy by covering a guest's deposit with personal funds. That's a fact." She paused, let the weight of it settle. "He also demonstrated more leadership in 5 minutes than some people show in 5 years." Around the table, executives shifted. A few nodded, almost imperceptibly. Others stared at the table like it might offer an escape route. "The question I've been asking myself," Andrea said, her voice quieter now, "is what kind of company punishes compassion while rewarding indifference? What kind of culture allows employees to mock guests and threaten colleagues without consequence?" Marcus's jaw tightened. Diane had gone very still. "I already know the answer," Andrea continued. "It's a culture that's lost its way. One that needs to remember why hospitality matters in the first place." She closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, her gaze moving deliberately around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "Mr. Holloway, Ms. Chen, your employment with Winifred Hospitality Group is terminated, effective immediately. HR will contact you about your final paychecks and benefits. You can collect your personal belongings under supervision." Marcus lurched to his feet. "You can't. This is—" "I can," Andrea said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And I am." Security appeared at the doorway as if summoned. George hadn't even noticed them arrive. Marcus and Diane were escorted out in stunned silence, the heavy door closing behind them with a soft, final click. The remaining executives looked like they wanted to disappear into the furniture. Andrea let the silence stretch. Then she turned her full attention back to George. "Now," she said, her expression softening just slightly, "we need to talk about you, Mr. Benson." George's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd been so focused on Marcus and Diane's termination that he'd almost forgotten, that he'd broken policy too, that his violation was documented just as clearly as their cruelty. "You helped me last night," Andrea said, "and in doing so, you broke a rule designed to protect the company from fraud and liability. I can't ignore that." George nodded. He'd known this was coming. "I understand." "Do you?" Andrea tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Do you understand why that rule exists?" "To protect the company's assets," George said. "To prevent employees from using guest transactions for personal gain or manipulation." "Exactly." Andrea tapped the closed folder in front of her. "The rule has merit. It serves a purpose. But here's what I'm struggling with, Mr. Benson." She leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped. "When a policy designed to prevent harm ends up preventing help, when following the rulebook means turning away someone in genuine need, what does that say about the rulebook?" George blinked. He hadn't expected the question. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Neither do I," Andrea said. "But I know this. Procedures can be taught. Systems can be learned. Character—" She paused, her gaze steady on his. "Character can't be trained into someone. Either you have it or you don't. She opened another folder, this one thinner, cleaner. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the Winifred Hospitality logo at the top. Mr. Benson, I've spent the last 6 hours reviewing your employment record. 6 years at this property, consistently high performance evaluations, multiple commendations from guests, 0 disciplinary actions until last night. She slid the paper across the table toward him. You know what I see when I look at this? George shook his head mutely. I see someone this company should have promoted years ago, Andrea said. Someone who understands what hospitality actually means. Someone who leads by example instead of waiting for permission. She gestured to the document in front of him. So now we talk about you, Mr. Benson, because I have a question only you can answer. George's hands trembled slightly as he looked down at the paper. It was a job description. Operations supervisor, management level, salary that made his current pay look like pocket change. Andrea's voice cut through the fog in his mind. Are you the kind of person who wants to fix a broken system? Or are you content to survive inside it? George looked up, met her eyes, and for the first time since walking into this room he understood what she was really asking. This wasn't about punishment, it was about choice. Now, Andrea said, her tone shifting into something that felt almost like a challenge, we talk about what happens next. George stared at the job description in front of him, the words blurring slightly at the edges. Operations Supervisor. The title felt foreign, like a language he'd studied but never spoken aloud. I don't understand, he said quietly. Andrea leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled in front of her. What don't you understand, Mr. Benson? Why you're offering me anything at all? George looked up, meeting her gaze directly. I broke policy. You said so yourself. The rule exists for a reason, and I ignored it. You did, Andrea agreed. Her expression didn't change. And if your motivation had been personal gain or manipulation or anything other than what it was, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. She gestured to the executives still seated around the table. 5 people who'd been silent witnesses to everything that had unfolded. George had almost forgotten they were there. But before we discuss your future, we need to address the present. Andrea's attention shifted to a woman in her 50s, seated to her right, someone George vaguely recognized from HR orientations. Ms. Patterson, you've been the Director of Human Resources for this property for how long? The woman straightened, clearly uncomfortable. 8 years, Ms. Winifred. 8 years, Andrea repeated. And in that time, how many complaints have been filed regarding staff conduct toward guests? Specifically regarding discriminatory language or treatment? Ms. Patterson's face tightened. I'd need to pull the exact numbers. 17, Andrea said. I pulled them this morning. 17 formal complaints in the past 3 years alone. Some were investigated. Most were dismissed as guest misunderstandings or communication issues. She paused, let that sink in. Would you like to explain how mocking a guest in the lobby qualifies as a communication issue? Silence. That's what I thought. Andrea's tone remained even, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. You're not being terminated, Miss Patterson, but you are being reassigned. Corporate HR will contact you about your new position by end of business today. The woman nodded stiffly, face flushed. Andrea turned to the next executive, a younger man in an expensive suit who looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Mr. Cho, you're the general manager of this property. That makes you responsible for culture, not just revenue. When employees feel comfortable mocking guests in a public space, that's a culture problem. When good employees are threatened with termination for showing compassion, that's a leadership problem. Mr. Cho opened his mouth, but Andrea held up a hand. I'm not interested in excuses, she said. I'm interested in solutions. You have 60 days to submit a comprehensive plan for cultural reform at this property, training protocols, accountability measures, guest feedback integration. If I don't see meaningful change, I'll find someone who can deliver it." "Yes, ma'am," Mr. Cho said, voice barely above a whisper. Andrea's gaze swept the table one final time. "Let me be very clear about something. This company was built on the idea that hospitality is an act of humanity, not a transaction. When we forget that, we don't just fail our guests, we fail ourselves." She let the words settle, heavy and undeniable. The people who were terminated today didn't lose their jobs because they enforced policy. They lost them because they weaponized it, because they chose cruelty when compassion was possible. That distinction matters. No one spoke. Andrea turned back to George. Her expression softened just slightly. "Mr. Benson, you admitted you broke policy. You're right. You did. Now tell me why." George had already answered this question, but he understood she was asking for something more, something deeper. "Because I've been on the other side of that desk," he said slowly. 7 years ago, I was the one who didn't have enough. I had my son with me. He was only 3, and we were out of options. A woman at a motel in Gary looked at me and saw a person instead of a problem. She bent the rules. She gave us a chance." His voice caught slightly. He pushed through it. "I know what one night of safety can mean when you're that close to the edge, and I couldn't—" He stopped, chose his words carefully. "I couldn't be the person who looks someone in the eye and says, 'Sorry, policy,' when I know there's another choice." Andrea nodded slowly. "Even knowing it could cost you your job?" "Even then." "Why?" George thought about Malik's drawing, about lights that stay on, about the kind of man he wanted his son to see when he looked at his father. "Because some things matter more than keeping a job," he said quietly. "And if the job requires me to stop being the kind of person I'm trying to raise my son to be, then it's not worth keeping anyway." The room had gone very still. Andrea studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression that George couldn't quite read. "You have a son?" she said. It wasn't a question, but George nodded anyway. "How old?" 10. "What's his name?" "Malik." Andrea's expression softened further. "And you're raising him alone?" "Yes, Mom." "That's not easy." "No," George agreed. "It's not." Andrea was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant, like she was seeing something beyond the conference room walls. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight it hadn't before. "My grandfather raised me," she said, "after my parents died. He worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat while building this company from nothing. I watched him choose dignity over profit more times than I can count. He always said the same thing. 'Andrea, the numbers matter, but the people matter more. Never forget which one you're actually serving.'" She looked back at George, and for the first time he saw past the CEO, past the authority, to the person underneath. "He would have done exactly what you did last night," she said, "and he would have been proud of it." George felt something loosen in his chest. "So, here's what I'm struggling with, Mr. Benson." Andrea leaned forward. "You broke a rule because you were following a principle. You risked everything because you understood what actually mattered. That's not insubordination. That's leadership." George blinked. "I'm not. I'm a front desk supervisor. I follow procedures. That's not the same as—" "Leadership isn't a title," Andrea interrupted gently. "It's a choice. It's what you do when the rule book and your conscience are pointing in different directions, and you have to decide which one you're going to follow." She tapped the job description still lying between them. "Last night you led. You showed me, and anyone who was paying attention, what this company's values actually mean in practice. Not in a training manual, not in a corporate mission statement. In the moment when it costs something real,
George's throat had gone tight. "I need people like you, Mr. Benson," Andrea continued. "Not just in this building, but in positions where they can actually shape culture, not just survive inside it. People who understand that the rules exist to serve people, not the other way around." She slid the paper closer to him. "So, I'm not offering you a promotion as a reward. I'm offering it because you've already proven you can do the job. You just haven't had the title yet." George looked down at the document. Operations supervisor, management level, real influence, the ability to change things instead of just witnessing them. His hands trembled slightly. "I don't know if I'm qualified." "Procedures can be taught," Andrea said firmly.
"Character can't. And you have the only qualification that truly matters. You give a damn about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." She stood, and everyone else at the table followed suit reflexively. George rose last, still trying to process what was happening. Andrea extended her hand across the table. "Take the weekend to think about it," she said. "Talk to your son. Consider what you want. But George," she waited until he met her eyes, "don't underestimate yourself. I'm not." George shook her hand, her grip firm and steady. "Thank you," he managed. "Don't thank me yet," Andrea said, and something that might have been a smile touched her lips. "If you accept, I'm going to expect a lot from you." She released his hand and gathered her folders. "We'll talk Monday morning, 9 a.m. This room." Andrea glanced at the remaining executives. "The rest of you, we're done here. Get to work." The room emptied quickly, everyone filing out like students dismissed from class. George lingered, still processing, still trying to reconcile the last 24 hours with anything that resembled reality. At the door, Andrea paused and looked back. "George," she said quietly. He turned. "Thank you for last night, for seeing me when you didn't have to." And then she was gone, leaving George alone in the conference room with a job offer, a racing heart, and the strange, fragile feeling of a future that had just cracked itself wide open. George stood in the empty conference room for a full minute after Andrea left, staring at the job description like it might evaporate if he looked away. Operations supervisor. The salary line made his chest tighten. It was nearly double what he made now, enough to cover bills without the mental gymnastics every month, enough to put something aside, enough to give Malik the stability George had been promising in small increments for years. He picked up the paper with careful hands and walked out. The hallway seemed different somehow, brighter. The corporate headshots on the walls looked less like distant authority and more like colleagues, people he might actually work alongside instead of beneath. George made it to the employee break room before his legs decided they needed a moment. He sat in one of the plastic chairs, the job description still clutched in his hands, and let himself breathe. His phone buzzed. A text from Malik's school. "Parent-teacher conferences next week. Please confirm attendance." George typed back a quick confirmation, then stared at the screen. Parent-teacher conferences, school supplies, new winter coat because Malik had grown 3 inches since last year, all the small, constant expenses that added up to barely making it, and now... The door swung open. Carol stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "George," she said carefully, "are you... okay?" He looked up at her. "I don't know yet." She stepped inside, let the door close behind her. "I heard what happened in there, some of it anyway." She paused. "Is it true? Did she really offer you ops supervisor?" George nodded mutely. Carol exhaled slowly. "Well, damn." "Yeah." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "You're going to take it, right?" "I don't know if I should." The words came out before George could stop them. "Carol, I've been working the desk for 6 years. I don't know anything about operations management, about logistics, about doing the job you've already been doing without the title or the pay." Carol interrupted. She leaned forward, elbows on the table. "George, you've been covering for incompetent managers since I've known you. You've been training new hires because nobody else bothers. You've been solving problems that should never reach the front desk in the first place." George shook his head. That's just doing the job." "No," Carol said firmly. "That's leading. You just weren't getting credit for it." He wanted to argue, wanted to list all the reasons he wasn't ready, wasn't qualified, didn't belong at that level. But the words stuck in his throat because he could hear Andrea's voice in his head. Procedures can be taught. Character cannot. "What if I mess it up?" he said quietly. Carol's expression softened. "Then you'll learn, same as everyone else." She stood, squeezed his shoulder once. "But for what it's worth, I don't think you will." George worked his shift in a daze. The lobby felt different, or maybe he felt different in it. Every interaction, checking in guests, answering questions, solving small crises, carried a new weight. This could be the last time he stood on this side of the desk. This could be the last shift where his only authority was a smile and a name tag. At 3:00 p.m., his replacement arrived early. George gathered his things, logged out of the system, and headed for the employee exit. He paused at the door and looked back. The lobby stretched before him, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, chandeliers casting warm pools of light, glass doors opening and closing as people moved between the cold outside world and the warmth within. He'd stood in this space for 6 years, watching people come and go, solving problems, following procedures, being invisible. Andrea's words echoed. I wanted to see what it felt like to be invisible. George understood that now in a way he hadn't before. Invisible wasn't just about being overlooked. It was about being seen only as a function, never as a person. It was about knowing you mattered, but never feeling like anyone else knew it. He thought about Marcus and Diane, about their easy dismissal of Andrea, about how quickly they'd decided she didn't deserve dignity. About how many times he'd watched similar scenes play out and said nothing because speaking up wasn't in his job description. The job description in his bag felt heavier now. This wasn't just about a promotion or a raise. It was about having a voice loud enough to change things. It was about making sure the next person standing where Andrea had stood last night wouldn't have to wonder if anyone would see them. George pushed through the exit into the November cold. That evening, he picked Malik up from after-school care with the job offer folded carefully in his jacket pocket right next to his heart. "Daddy!" Malik ran over, backpack bouncing. "Guess what? We learned about the solar system today, and I told everyone my dad works at the fanciest hotel in Chicago, and Mrs. Jenkins said that's really cool." George caught him in a hug, breathed in the scent of crayons and playground dirt. "It is pretty cool, isn't it?" "Yeah," Malik said proudly. "You have the best job." George's throat tightened. "What if I told you my job might be changing?" Malik pulled back, eyes wide. "Are you leaving the hotel?" "No, baby. I'd still be at the same place, just doing something different, something bigger." "Like what?" George thought about how to explain operations management to a 10-year-old. "Like helping make sure the whole hotel runs smoothly, making decisions, helping other people do their jobs better." Malik considered this seriously. "Would you still wear your name tag?" George smiled. "Probably." "Okay then. That sounds good." They walked to the train, hands linked. Malik chattered about planets and black holes and whether hotels existed in space. George listened, responded, but part of his mind was already 3 days ahead. Monday morning, 9 a.m., walking back into that conference room, saying yes.
At home, after dinner and homework and the bedtime routine, George sat at the kitchen table with the job description spread in front of him. The numbers still looked impossible, the responsibilities still looked daunting. But for the first time in 6 years, they also looked possible. He thought about Andrea asking why he'd helped her, about admitting that some things mattered more than keeping a job, about Malik's drawing with its glowing windows and connected hands, about doors that opened instead of closed. George pulled out his phone and typed a message to the HR email listed at the bottom of the offer letter. "I accept. Thank you for this opportunity." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Then he walked to Malik's room, stood in the doorway, and watched his son sleep. The streetlight outside cast everything in soft amber. Malik's drawings covered one wall, buildings with bright windows, stick figures holding hands, futures imagined in coloured pencil. "We're going to be okay," George whispered. "Better than okay." For the first time in a long time, he believed it. The first Monday of George's new role began at 7:00 a.m. with a stack of operational reports, a laptop he was still learning to navigate, and coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. His office, was small but functional. A desk, 2 chairs, a window overlooking the street below. His name was already on the door: George Benson, Operations Supervisor. He'd walked past it 3 times that morning just to make sure it was real. By 9:30, he was in his first department meeting. Housekeeping schedules, maintenance backlogs, staffing rotations. The kind of logistical puzzles he'd watched other people solve from a distance. Now they were his to untangle. It was overwhelming. It was exhausting. It was exactly where he needed to be. 2 weeks in, Andrea announced the first major reform. The email went out to all staff at 8:00 a.m. Effective immediately, Winifred Hospitality is establishing an emergency guest assistance fund. George read it twice, then a third time to make sure he understood. The fund would provide bridge assistance for guests facing unexpected financial hardship, medical emergencies, travel disruptions, temporary housing needs, managed by a committee, overseen by corporate. Designed to help without judgment. At the bottom of the announcement was a single line. "Compassion is not a policy violation. It's our foundation." George thought about $40 on a marble counter, about Andrea's trembling hands, about how easily one night could mean everything. He forwarded the email to Carol with a single word: "Finally." She wrote back immediately. "About damn time." The bias training rolled out in phases: mandatory sessions for all customer-facing staff, voluntary workshops for management. George attended both. The trainer, a woman named Dr. Okafor, didn't pull punches. She showed scenarios, played back real audio from guest complaints, asked hard questions about assumptions people made before anyone opened their mouth. George watched his former coworkers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some engaged seriously. Others resented the implication that they needed correction. During a break, Dr. Okafor approached him. "You're the one, aren't you?" she said quietly. "The one from the incident that started all this?" George nodded. "Good," she said. "We need people like you in these rooms. People who've lived what we're trying to teach." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded again. George's interactions with Andrea were professional, respectful, and strangely easy. She attended his operational reviews, asked questions that sharpened his thinking rather than challenged it, offered suggestions without undermining his authority. When he implemented a new protocol for guest complaint escalation, she sent a brief email. "Well done. This is exactly what we needed. He saved it." They passed each other in hallways, exchanged updates in meetings, collaborated on policy revisions. The girl from the lobby and the woman running the company existed simultaneously now, both real,
both present, neither erasing the other. George noticed the way she listened, really listened, the way she remembered details, names of staff members' children, someone's upcoming surgery, a housekeeper's worry about her mother. She led the way his grandfather must have led, with attention, with intention, with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. At home, Malik noticed the changes before George fully registered them himself. "You're happier," Malik said one evening, completely unprompted. They were eating dinner at the wobbly kitchen table, spaghetti with sauce from a jar, garlic bread from the freezer. George looked up. "What makes you say that?" Malik shrugged, twirling pasta on his fork. "You smile more now, and you don't look so tired all the time." George's chest tightened. "I'm still tired, baby, just a different kind." "The good kind?" "Yeah," George said softly. "The good kind." Malik grinned. "Good, because you deserve good things, Daddy." Out of the mouths of children, George thought, truth delivered with complete innocence. That weekend, Malik finished a new drawing. This one showed the hotel again, but different, more detailed, more alive. Windows glowed in different colors. People stood at the entrance, doors held open. At the bottom, in careful letters, "Where my dad helps people." George taped it to the wall in his office the following Monday. 3 weeks into his new role, George arrived early to find Andrea already in the lobby. Not for an inspection, not for a meeting. Just standing there, coffee in hand, watching the morning light filter through the glass doors. She wore jeans and a sweater instead of the tailored suits he'd gotten used to seeing in conference rooms. Her hair was pulled back simply. She looked younger somehow. More like the girl who'd needed help than the CEO who'd rewritten the rules. George approached slowly. "Morning." Andrea turned, smiled. "Morning, George. I didn't expect anyone else to be here this early." "Could say the same about you." She gestured to the lobby around them. "I like it when it's quiet, before the rush starts, when you can still see what the space is supposed to feel like." George looked around, at the polished marble, the warm lighting, the doors that opened easily for anyone who approached. "It feels different now," he said. "Doesn't it?" "It does," Andrea agreed. She took a sip of her coffee, gaze distant. "My grandfather used to say, buildings don't have souls. People give them souls. The energy they bring, the choices they make inside them. That's what makes a place feel like something more than walls and floors." George thought about that, about Marcus and Diane, their mockery still echoing faintly in his memory, about the lobby as it had been, beautiful but cold, welcoming only to those who looked like they belonged, and about how it felt now, still beautiful, but warmer, more honest. "He was right," George said. Andrea nodded. "He usually was." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd accidentally changed each other's lives, learning how to exist in the aftermath. "Thank you," Andrea said finally, "for taking the risk, for accepting the position, for believing this place could be better." George met her eyes. "Thank you for seeing me when you didn't have to." She smiled. Small, genuine, the kind of smile that reached her eyes. "I think we saw each other, George. That's what made the difference." Behind them, the first guests of the morning began arriving. The lobby started filling with voices, movement, life. The day was beginning. But for just a moment longer, George and Andrea stood in the quiet space between what had been and what was becoming. Two people who'd opened doors for each other and found themselves walking through together. 6 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in early spring, George brought Malik to the hotel. It wasn't planned. They'd been walking through downtown after lunch, and Malik had asked, for the 100th time, if he could see where Daddy worked now, really see it. Not just the lobby, but everything. George had hesitated.
The hotel wasn't a tourist attraction, but then he'd thought about Andrea's words. People give buildings their souls, and he'd said yes. They entered through the main doors, Malik's hand tucked securely in his. The lobby was busy with the weekend crowd, families checking in for spring break, business travelers catching flights, couples celebrating anniversaries. The energy hummed, alive and welcoming. Malik's eyes went wide. "Whoa," George smiled. "Pretty impressive, right?" "It's even better than my drawings," Malik whispered, awed. They were standing near the front desk when Andrea appeared from the direction of the elevators. She wore casual clothes, slacks and a blouse. Her hair down, she looked like she'd been visiting the upper floors, checking in on things the way she did most weekends. Her eyes found George's, then dropped to Malik. "Well," she said, approaching with a warm smile, "you must be Malik." Malik looked up at his father, uncertain. George squeezed his shoulder gently. "Malik, this is Ms. Winifred. She's the person who runs the whole company." Malik's eyes went even wider. "The whole company?" "The whole company," Andrea confirmed, crouching slightly to be at eye level. "And your dad has told me a lot about you. He says you're an artist." Malik nodded shyly. "I draw buildings mostly, like this one." "I'd love to see your work sometime," Andrea said. "I bet you capture things the architects miss." Malik's face lit up. "Really?" "Really." George watched them interact, Andrea patient and genuine, Malik slowly warming up, his natural curiosity overcoming his shyness. Something in his chest loosened. This wasn't CEO and employee. This was just two people meeting for the first time, finding common ground. "Ms. Winifred," Malik said suddenly, his voice taking on that serious tone children use when they're working something out. "My dad says you're the one who gave him his new job." Andrea glanced up at George, then back at Malik. "I offered him the position, but he's the one who earned it." Malik considered this carefully. "He told me he helped you once, when you needed it, and that's why everything changed." Andrea's expression softened. "That's true." "So?" Malik tilted his head. "If you help people, good things happen?" The question hung in the air, innocent and profound in the way only children's questions could be. Andrea looked at George, something passing between them, an acknowledgement of everything that had led to this moment. Then she turned back to Malik. "Sometimes," she said gently. "Not always. Sometimes you help someone, and nothing changes. Sometimes it costs you something real, but I think—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think doing the right thing changes you, even when it doesn't change your circumstances. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it changes both." Malik absorbed this with the seriousness of a philosopher. Then he nodded, satisfied. "Daddy says some things matter more than being safe. He says that's what brave means." George's throat tightened. He'd said that once, late at night, when Malik had asked why he'd risked his job for a stranger. "Your dad's right," Andrea said quietly, "and he's one of the bravest people I know." Later, after Andrea had excused herself to handle a guest issue and Malik had explored the lobby to his heart's content, George and his son sat on one of the plush benches near the windows. The afternoon sun poured through the glass, turning everything golden. Malik swung his legs, content and tired in the way kids get after a good day. "Daddy," he said. "Yeah, baby." "I'm glad you helped her. Ms. Winifred, I mean." George looked down at him. "Why's that?" Malik shrugged. "Because now the lights stay on." George blinked. "What?" "At home," Malik explained, like it was obvious. "Remember how sometimes the lights used to turn off? And you said it was because we had to save electricity." "But I knew it was because we didn't have enough money." George's heart clenched. He'd thought Malik hadn't noticed. Children always noticed.
They don't turn off anymore, Malik continued. And you're home more. And you're happy. So I'm glad you helped her, even when it was scary. George pulled his son close, pressed a kiss to the top of his head. Me too, baby. Me too. That evening, as the sun set and the hotel's exterior lights began to glow against the darkening sky, George stood at his office window. From here, he could see the entrance below. The doors that never stopped opening, the steady flow of people moving between the cold outside and the warmth within. He thought about the night 6 months ago, about $40 that had felt like everything, about a choice that could have destroyed him, but had instead rebuilt his entire life. Andrea had been right. Buildings didn't have souls. People gave them souls through the choices they made inside them. This hotel had been beautiful before, but now it was something more. It was a place that remembered its purpose, a place where policy served people instead of the other way around. A place where someone like him, someone who'd stood on both sides of the desk, could shape what hospitality actually meant. His phone buzzed. A text from Andrea. Thank you for bringing Malik by. He's wonderful. You're raising him right. George typed back. Trying to. Thank you for seeing us both. Her response came quickly. Always. He pocketed his phone and looked back out the window. The lights glowed warm and steady. The doors stayed open. People came and went, each one carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own moments of needing help or offering it. George thought about the question that had haunted him that night in November. What did it cost to do the right thing? $40, a policy violation, the very real risk of losing everything. And what had it given back? Everything he hadn't known he needed. A future, stability, purpose, the chance to shape the world instead of just surviving in it. The ability to look his son in the eye and know he'd chosen dignity over safety. Some people said kindness was free. George knew better. Kindness cost something. It always did. But sometimes, if you were very lucky, if you were very brave, it gave back more than you'd ever imagined possible. The lights stayed on. The doors stayed open. And somewhere in the city, another person would stand where he'd stood, desperate and afraid, praying someone would see them. And maybe, just maybe, someone would. Because one act of compassion had rewritten the rules, and the ripples were still spreading. George turned away from the window, gathered his things, and headed home to the son who believed the lights would never go out again. He had every intention of proving him right.